Today we are going to explore one of the most fascinating and little-known realities of the Middle Ages. What actually happened to those who dared to attempt an escape from life within a great fiefdom, challenging a social order built over centuries to appear immutable. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine an autumn morning in the heart of medieval Europe. The sky has not yet completely cleared, and amidst the fog covering the fields, hunched figures are already moving between the rows of wheat. They are men, women, and even children who work land that does not belong to them, inhabit houses that are not theirs, and obey rules they never chose. In the background, atop a hill, stands the feudal lord's castle, as solid as the very social hierarchy that sustains it. For the majority of people who lived between the 9th and 14th centuries in Europe, that horizon was the only one that existed. To be born, live, and die within the limits of the fiefdom was not just a daily reality. It was, in many senses, the only conceivable reality. But what led someone to question this order? And what happened when someone decided to simply leave, without permission, without documents, without a certain destination? To understand the weight of that decision, one must first understand what the fiefdom was, and who the people inhabiting it were. The European feudal system, which consolidated itself throughout the 9th and 10th centuries from the political reorganizations promoted by the Carolingian kings, functioned like a pyramid of mutual obligations. At the top, the king distributed land to nobles and lords in exchange for loyalty and military service. These lords, in turn, ceded portions of land to lesser vassals and so on, until reaching the base of the pyramid, the peasants, and among them, the central figure of medieval rural life, the serf. Serfs were the backbone of the feudal economy. It was they who cultivated the fields, cared for the animals, kept the mills running, and supported with their labor the entire structure that rose above them. And in this structure, they occupied a legally ambiguous and deeply vulnerable position. They were not slaves in the sense the word carried in classical antiquity, for they possessed certain recognized rights, could have their own tools, small gardens, and even some livestock. But they were not free men in the full sense of the expression either. They were tied to the land in a way that medievalist historians define with a Latin expression that has traversed the centuries: glebae ad scripti, bound to the soil. This attachment to the land had concrete and profound implications that shaped every aspect of daily existence. The serf could not abandon the fiefdom without the express authorization of his lord. He could not marry someone from another fiefdom without paying a fee and obtaining formal permission, a practice that in some territories was called foremarriage. He could not pass his children on to another land, because children were also born serfs, tied to the same soil as their parents, by a destiny that repeated itself from generation to generation, without anyone questioning its legitimacy. Every aspect of a serf's life was regulated and taxed. There was the corvée, the obligation to work for free on the lord's land for a certain number of days a week, which could amount to 3 or 4 days during periods of higher agricultural demand. There was the taille, a tax levied by French lords on the income of serfs, with no fixed limit established by law. There was the heriot, demanded by English lords when a serf passed away, which consisted of handing over the family's best animal as payment for the right of the son to inherit his father's land. And there were countless other fees, tolls, and obligations that made life on the fief an existence of continuous labor and constant vigilance, where any modest accumulation of resources could be drained by new manorial demands at any moment. The material conditions of existence varied from fief to fief and from century to century, but in general terms, the life of a medieval serf was marked by physical hardship, food insecurity, and an almost absolute dependence on the lord's will. Dwellings were simple structures of wood, straw and wattle and daub, often shared with domestic animals to take advantage of the heat during European winters. The diet was based on cereals such as rye and barley, legumes, and, rarely, meat. A bad harvest or an untimely frost could mean real famine for entire families during the winter months. And in times of war, it was the peasants who paid the highest price, with their fields devastated by the advance of armies and their resources confiscated to support the lord's campaigns. But the aspect that weighed most heavily on the serf's conscience was not just the material poverty. It was the feeling of perpetual immobility, the realization that no matter how hard one worked or how much one endured, the horizon always remained the same. The feudal lord exercised a power that went far beyond the economic. He was also the local judge, the arbiter of disputes, the one responsible for the safety of the community, and, in many cases, the intermediary between the peasants and the church. Challenging the lord was, in many ways, challenging the very order of the world. In a deeply religious society such as the medieval one, where social hierarchy was often presented as a reflection of divine will, this carried a spiritual weight that added to the physical and the legal. And yet, there were those who tried to leave. The reasons that led a serf to consider fleeing were varied, and most of the time built up over years of silent resignation that reached its limit. A season of poor harvests that left not enough food to make it through the winter. A particularly harsh or greedy lord who increased tributes beyond what was considered customary. The death of a spouse or a child that destabilized the family and made feudal obligations impossible to fulfill. Rumors that arrived through itinerant merchants or pilgrims traveling the roads toward distant shrines about villages and cities where there was paid work and where the eyes of the feudal lord could not reach. Sometimes it was simply the desire to find a loved one who had been sold to another fief, or the need to escape a lord who decided to transfer his lands along with the serfs who inhabited them to another nobleman, as if they were part of an estate's inventory. The act of fleeing was, in itself, an undertaking fraught with difficulties that began long before the serf took the first step beyond the borders of the fief. Contrary to what is sometimes imagined, medieval fiefs were not territories enclosed by walls or guard towers. The borders were marked by geographical features, stone markers, or simply by the collective memory of where one lord's land ended and another's began. In theory, a serf could simply walk away. In practice, however, the obstacles were enormous and piled upon one another in a way that made flight a high-risk adventure. The first obstacle was a profound ignorance of the world. The vast majority of serfs had never traveled more than a few kilometers from their birthplace. Medieval roads were few, poorly maintained, and dangerous, and the dense forests that covered vast stretches of Europe represented real threats to travelers who were solitary and lacked resources. The second obstacle was the absence of identity documents. In a society where a person's identity was intimately linked to the place from which they came, a runaway serf was someone without a legible identity. Any stranger who arrived in a village without explaining where they came from was immediately suspicious, and the villagers whose interests depended on good relations with local lords did not hesitate to report the presence of strangers. The network of social surveillance in medieval Europe was informal but surprisingly effective. The third obstacle was of a legal nature. Medieval law treated the flight of a serf as a serious offense against the established social order. In Carolingian France, capitularies and local customs clearly defined the obligations of serfs and the penalties for flight. In England, the manorial courts, the seigneurial tribunals of each fief, had explicit authority to judge and punish serfs who abandoned the land without permission. In almost all of Europe, the fundamental principle was the same. The serf belonged to the fief where they had been born. When a runaway serf was captured, the legal process varied according to the region, the historical period, and the disposition of the lord, but it followed a generally recognizable logic. In the English system, particularly well documented by the records of medieval manorial courts that survived in the archives of Ramsey Abbey and the manor of Halesowen, the captured serf was taken back to the fief and tried in the manorial court. There the lord or his representative presented the accusation, and the serf had very little capacity for defense, given that the very nature of their legal status placed them in a structural position of disadvantage before the authority judging them. Typical punishment included the loss of any goods accumulated during the period of flight, an increase in labor obligations to compensate for the period of absence, fines to be paid to the lord, and sometimes the revocation of privileges such as the right to use the communal mill or to keep their own livestock. In cases of repeated flight, punishments tended to become progressively more severe. In extreme situations, Especially when the serf had incited others to flee along with them, they could be sold to a lord in more distant territory, a forced transfer that erased any ties the serf had with their community of origin. But there was one dimension of punishment that historical records reveal clearly: ritualized public humiliation. In a small community where everyone knew one another, being brought back as a captured fugitive was an indelible mark. Some lords demanded formal ceremonies of submission in which the serf would publicly acknowledge their transgression. These ceremonies were designed not only to punish the individual, but to send a message to the entire community. Escape had a price, and that price was paid in public. There was also the spiritual dimension, which in medieval Europe carried a weight difficult to assess with modern eyes. The Catholic Church permeated every aspect of medieval life and had a complex relationship with the feudal system. It taught that all human beings were equal before God, but it also legitimized the established social order as a reflection of a divine hierarchy, and local priests, who depended on the patronage of feudal lords, rarely preached against the structural injustices of the system. A fugitive serf who sought shelter in a church could invoke the right of asylum, a temporary protection guaranteed by canon law that prevented secular authorities from entering sacred spaces to carry out captures by force. But this shelter was, by its nature, provisional. Ecclesiastical asylum did not free the serf. It merely temporarily suspended punishment while a solution was negotiated. In practice, many cases of asylum ended with the serf leaving voluntarily after receiving promises of clemency from the Lord, promises that were not always honored as expected. This does not mean that all fugitives were captured. Medieval history is punctuated by cases of serfs who managed to escape successfully, building new lives in distant territories. Records about them are, by nature, scarcer than the records about those who were captured and tried. After all, the system had an interest in documenting the failures of resistance, not its successes. One of the most promising paths to freedom was the city. Throughout the 11th and 12th centuries, European cities began to grow at an accelerated pace, driven by trade and craftsmanship. These cities developed an identity of their own, distinct from the rural feudal order, and with it new forms of social and legal organization that created spaces where the logic of serfdom had difficulty asserting itself. In the territories of the Holy Roman Empire, the principle expressed in the German formula that can be translated as "city air makes you free" gradually took hold. This principle, formalized in various municipal charters and privileges throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, established that a serf who lived in a city for a certain period, typically a year and a day, without being claimed by their lord, acquired full legal freedom. It was, in medieval terms, an amnesty earned by the simple fact of surviving urban anonymity long enough. For this to work in practice, the serf needed to reach the city and find work without drawing attention to their origins. In larger cities further away from their home fief, this possibility was real. A peasant who arrived in a city like Cologne, Paris, London, or Florence could more easily disappear among the heterogeneous crowd of craftsmen, merchants, laborers, and pilgrims. They could find work in a blacksmith's shop, in a bakery, or in the construction of the countless cathedrals that dotted the medieval landscape, and over time become part of city life without anyone asking inconvenient questions. But this path was much easier to describe than to traverse. Most serfs who fled lacked the necessary resources to reach a large city. Many were captured in the first few days of their journey. Others arrived in the city only to discover that medieval urban life brought its own perils. Disease, extreme poverty for those without a recognized trade, and the hostility of closed-off communities that did not easily welcome newcomers without references. Women who attempted to flee faced even greater challenges. In a society that did not recognize a woman's right to travel alone without male guardianship, a lone woman on medieval roads was automatically suspicious and vulnerable to dangers that went far beyond mere capture by her lord. Some fled accompanied by husbands or brothers, turning the escape into a family project. Others sought out convents, where religious life offered an alternative form of belonging and, in some cases, protection against seigneurial claims. And as these individual stories unfolded across the fields and roads of medieval Europe, The world was accumulating tensions that no system, no matter how rigid, could contain indefinitely. In the winter of 1347, a fleet of Genoese ships from the Black Sea arrived at the port of Messina, in Sicily. What these ships brought with them would forever change the trajectory of Europe and the balance of power between lords and serfs. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis and transmitted primarily through fleas, spread across the European continent with a speed and lethality unprecedented in recorded history. In less than 4 years, between 1347 and 1351, the disease claimed the lives of approximately 1/3 of the European population, with estimates ranging between 20 and 50 million people, depending on the region and sources consulted. For feudal serfs, the Black Death represented a paradoxical transformation. The suffering was immense. Entire families disappeared in a matter of weeks, villages were emptied, fields were left without anyone to cultivate them. But the same catastrophe that devastated entire communities created, for the first time in centuries, a genuine shortage of agricultural labor. Feudal lords who once had an abundance of serfs suddenly found themselves with fertile lands and no one to work them. Land, the most valuable resource of the feudal system, was worthless without those to cultivate it. This inversion of the balance of power created conditions that no serf of previous generations had experienced. For the first time, lords needed serfs more than serfs needed lords to simply survive. In some regions, serfs who would have previously been captured and punished for fleeing were now actively courted by lords offering better conditions to stay or move to their lands. In other regions, the seigneurial response to the labor shortage was the exact opposite, tightening controls and increasing labor demands. This second response revealed the fear that lay at the root of all the rigidity of the feudal system. The fear that, once serfs experienced the possibility of choice, the system could never work the same way again. In England, Parliament reacted to the post-epidemic labor crisis with the Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351 by King Edward III. This law attempted to freeze wages at pre-epidemic levels and prohibited rural and urban workers from leaving their usual places of residence in search of better conditions. It was an attempt to use the power of the state to reverse the economic transformations that the disease had created. The Statute of Labourers was widely unpopular, and its enforcement was inconsistent, but it clearly reveals what the ruling elites feared, that the free movement of labor would undo the social hierarchy that sustained the feudal system. The tensions that had accumulated over the decades following the Black Death exploded into revolts that shook Europe in the 14th century. In 1358, in a France devastated by epidemic and war, peasants north of Paris rose up in the revolt known as the Jacquerie, a name derived from the derogatory expression Jacques Bonhomme, used by the nobility to refer generically to the common peasant. The Jacquerie was an explosion of anger, accumulated from decades of rising taxes, poor harvests, and the humiliation of a nobility that continued to demand its tributes with the same inflexibility as ever, even while being unable to protect its subjects during the 100 Years' War. Within weeks, the revolt had spread across dozens of fiefdoms. The main leader, Guillaume Calle, was captured under false promises of negotiation and did not survive. The uprising was suppressed with extreme harshness, and the promised concessions were withdrawn as soon as the immediate threat had passed. 23 years later, in 1381, England experienced its own historical crisis. The Peasants' Revolt, known by the name of one of its main leaders, Wat Tyler, was precipitated by the attempt to impose a new poll tax, which disproportionately affected the poorest. The English peasants, especially those from Kent and Essex, demanded the complete abolition of serfdom and the freedom to work wherever they chose. John Ball, an itinerant priest who preached radically egalitarian ideas, became one of the central voices of the movement. The revolt reached London, where the young King Richard II, only 14 years old, met personally with the rebels at Smithfield. Wat Tyler did not survive the encounter, the movement fragmented, and the promised concessions were quickly withdrawn. John Ball was captured and did not survive the repression that followed. And yet the story did not end there. The ideas that Ball and Tyler had put into circulation about the natural equality of men, about the injustice of hereditary serfdom, about the right of workers to move and choose their employers, did not disappear with the defeat of the rebels. They continued to circulate in heterodox sermons, in tavern conversations, and in the collective memory of rural communities that transmitted them from generation to generation. In other parts of Europe, similar dynamics developed with their own particularities. In the Iberian Peninsula, the wars of reconquest created needs for repopulation that often generated incentives for the displacement of peasants in exchange for more favorable conditions. In Italy, life in commercial city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Florence had created an economic reality so dynamic that rural serfdom was, in many respects, a peripheral phenomenon in relation to the center of economic power. This set of transformations reveals something fundamental. The feudal system was neither static nor monolithic. It was a set of power relations that adapted to the economic, demographic, and political conditions of each region. And in all these contexts, the question of who had the right to move and under what conditions was central to determining who held power and who was subject to it. It is also important to highlight that not all stories of mobility were stories of desperate flight. There were legal mechanisms through which a serf could obtain their freedom officially. Manumission, the formal liberation of a serf, recognized by custom and law, was a practice throughout the entire Middle Ages. A lord could grant freedom to a serf out of gratitude for exceptional service, for spiritual reasons, as the Church taught that freeing a serf was an act of mercy, or for purely practical motives. There was also the possibility, rare but documented, of purchasing one's own freedom through direct negotiation with the lord, a process that required not only financial resources that most serfs did not possess, but also the lord's genuine willingness to accept the transaction. What all these mechanisms had in common was the need for the lord's approval. The system was constructed to ensure that any change in status was mediated by feudal power rather than obtained unilaterally by the serf. Unauthorized flight was precisely the act that challenged this logic head-on, that said no to the lord without waiting for his permission, and that asserted, through the most concrete action possible, that the serf had a will of their own and the capacity to act upon it. This is why the reaction to a captured fugitive was often disproportionate to the immediate economic loss the serf had caused. Symbolically, flight was an affront to the very order of things, an implicit declaration that the hierarchy was not a law of nature, but a human construct that could be questioned. And it was precisely this questioning that needed to be suppressed publicly, not only to recover the lost worker, but to preserve the collective belief that the system was immutable. The records of English manorial courts offer a detailed window into these processes. Documents such as those from the Manor of Hale Samhain and the archives of Ramsey Abbey reveal specific cases of serfs accused of flight, of harboring fugitives, or of helping neighbors escape, showing that flight was a recurring phenomenon throughout the medieval period. There are cases of serfs who fled repeatedly, were captured, and fled again. There are entire families who vanished from a fief in a single night. There are serfs who found shelter in monasteries, or with other lords who feigned ignorance of their origins. And there are cases that disappear completely from the records, suggesting the existence of informal support networks for fugitives, of communities that chose not to report strangers, and of lords who preferred not to spend resources pursuing every one of their missing serfs. The system was pervasive, but it was not omniscient, and in its gaps lived those who managed to build a different life. As we move toward the end of the Middle Ages, the pressures on the feudal system became increasingly intense. The growth of cities, the development of long-distance trade, and the gradual emergence of a monetary economy that allowed for labor relations based on wages eroded the foundations of the serf system in ways that were irresistible on the scale of generations. By the end of the 15th century, serfdom had disappeared in most Western European countries, not through a single revolutionary political decision, but through a slow and uneven erosion. In England, the gradual replacement of labor obligations with cash payments had transformed the relationship between lords and peasants long before any formal law declared serfdom abolished. In France, the process was equally gradual, and traces of formal serfdom persisted in some regions well into the 16th century. But the question of what happened to those who tried to escape from a large medieval fiefdom is not merely a matter of laws, punishments, and mechanisms of social control. It is also a much deeper and more universal question about the human condition under circumstances of extreme restriction. It is a question about what people do when the structure around them seems to leave no room for change, about how hope survives in conditions of seemingly total immobility, and about the small acts of resistance that do not appear in great history books, but which, added up over decades and generations, contribute decisively to transforming the world. Each serf who tried to flee, regardless of whether they were captured or achieved some form of freedom, was asserting something fundamental: that the order of things was not simply given once and for all, that it could be questioned, and that there were alternatives to the destiny determined by the accident of birth. These serfs did not possess the conceptual tools that later centuries would provide to articulate these longings in terms of individual rights or political liberty. But the act of leaving, of putting one foot in front of the other toward an unknown horizon, was in itself one of the most elementary and powerful forms of human declaration. Medieval history has rarely left us the names of these common people. We know Wat Tyler and Guillaume Carle because they led revolts recorded by chroniclers with the attention that the elite devoted to events that threatened them. But the thousands who silently tried to flee their fiefdoms over the centuries, who walked deep into the night along the roads of medieval Europe, who were captured and returned to the same soil as always, or who disappeared forever into the anonymity of a distant city, building a new life without a name and without a past, these remain largely faceless and voiceless in the records that have survived time. And perhaps it is precisely this absence that makes their story so powerful. It reminds us that history is not made only by kings, generals, and lawmakers, but also by ordinary people who, at some point in their lives, looked at the invisible borders surrounding them and decided that it might be worth risking everything to see what lay on the other side. The world that emerged from the ruins of European feudalism was not perfect, and new forms of dependency arose to replace the old ones. But the process by which feudalism was gradually dismantled included among its many elements these countless acts of individual disobedience, these escapes that sometimes failed and sometimes found their destination, this obstinate refusal over generations to accept that the place where one had been born should be the place where one was to die. The Middle Ages is often depicted as an era of stagnation where people accepted their fate with passive resignation. The serfs who tried to flee their fiefdoms are one of the most concrete pieces of evidence that this image is incomplete. Change happened even when it seemed impossible. Freedom was sought even when the price was very high. It was in this tense and precarious space, between established order and individual transgression, between the fear of consequences and the hope for something different, that one of the most human stories of the Middle Ages unfolded, and one of the most relevant for us to understand what it means in any age to want to be free. If this journey through medieval fields and the roads few dared to travel has sparked in you the same curiosity that drove us to build it, then you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel and become part of this community that isn't afraid to dive deep into the stories time has all but forgotten. Leave a like so that more people can find this content, and tell us in the comments, if you lived in the Middle Ages, would you have dared to try to escape? Your answer might be the start of a conversation well worth having.